Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to this edition of BookBytes on Salam Media. We have a fabulous interviews lined up for today on one of probably the coldest days of the year. So we hope to inspire you to pick up a novel that will definitely keep you indoors until you've gone through it. Our interviewee for today is South African journalist and editor Aisha Kassiem. She's the author of the debut novel Suitcase of Memory. Her career spans almost 2 decades. She's been news editor at the Cape Times and News 24, as well as editor of Fin 24 and Print Week in Dubai. She's a fellow of the German-based International Journalist Program and the US State Department's International Leadership Program. As I said, Suitcase of Memory is her debut novel, and I look forward to both welcoming and chatting to Aisha about this novel. Aisha, welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum salam and good evening. Shukran so much for having me, Shafinaaz. I'm so excited to be here and thrilled to be talking to you about this book.
Such a beautiful book, baby, and obviously it came with its own timeline, because you say in a few of your interviews already that it took 15 years. Talk to us about process, about timing, and about timeline as well.
I love that you asked me that question and that you talk about, this timeline, and every book has its own timeline. I mean, being a writer, is such a difficult thing, as I'm sure you can relate to as well, and it's almost a volatile relationship that you have with your work. Some days you write something and you think, oh, wow, this was really good, and 5 minutes later you read the same paragraph you've just written and think it's the worst thing that you've ever read, and so for me, that has pretty much been the relationship with this book for 15 years. It's been a stop and start and abandoned, and I abandoned it several times, and sometimes it was about failure, and other times it was, it came together. But I really want people to understand, that is pretty much how success works in the real world. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't necessarily take 15 years, but be that as it may, it is a process of failure very often, and trying again until you get that story just the way you want it.
So do you think it really is also about the book being ready, or the writer being ready to put it out there? Is the writer mummy to put your baby out there in the world, so to speak?
I think it's a combination of both. I think when you're writing a story, or at least in terms of Suitcase of Memory, this kind of story, I think, needed me to be at a certain level of emotional maturity. I think had I written this book when I was 20, which was when I first started coming up with the idea, it would have been a very, very different book to the one that exists today, that I wrote 15 years later. I think writers need to have lived a little bit, you need to have experienced a little bit of life, and you need to have observed and understood people a little bit better, in order to really grasp the various nuances, I think, that I hope I capture in the characters in this book.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think also this leap that you've made from being sort of the fact finder, the journalist, and then writing and creating these characters, and taking on the next dimension of creating characters and imagining their dialogue. The jump from journalistic writing to fiction. Was that easy? Was it a smooth process? What did it require of you as a writer?
So, people ask me this question quite often. They think it's these two different worlds. But for me, I've always thought of myself as being a storyteller. Whether I was a journalist, or now as a novelist. Bottom line, you're trying to tell a story, whether that story is factual or not. And with Suitcase of Memory, I like to think of it as being this seamless transition, really, for me as a journalist and as a novelist, because so much of the book itself is centered in fact. So sure, the story is fictional, but there are various things that are in this book that are absolutely factual. Least of all, the time period that this book is set in, which is from the 1940s to the 1960s, South Africa. There's also reference to the Race Classification Appeals Board, which was a real place that actually existed in South Africa at one time, and various facts that emerge in the second part of the book in particular, which relates to the trial that happens in this book, are all factual in terms of the evidence and the testimony that the various witnesses speak about in the book.
I find it fascinating how you give life to these trials. The legal aspects, the absurdity of legality within the time of apartheid South Africa. But before we get into the meat of that, let's talk about your protagonist. I mean, you have your characters have amazing depth, and you've got a wide range of characters, and they're so beautifully layered within their themes. But Bastian Bredenkamp is a dead person. Let's start with that. Right? And there's nothing dead about him. I found that it's not an easy task. So to say that you're a debut novelist is not like this is a newbie. This is right as your first book. You've done this amazing thing of giving life to a dead protagonist who has an amazing memory. Talk to us about reflection through your narrative and potentially regret, and the choice to use a dead man.
Yeah. So there was a lot of questions in that one question, I must say, Shafinaaz. So maybe just to give a bit of context, I think, for someone who hasn't read the book. So the narrator is Bastian Bredenkamp, and Bastian Bredenkamp, as you say, is a dead old guy, actually. And he has this rare condition, which is a legitimate condition, called hypothymesia, and he can basically remember everything in minute detail that ever happened to him since the day he was born. So that is the backstory. And so Bastian tells you the story of his life, this extraordinary story of his life from the grave. And for me, the number one thing about having Bastian be dead from the beginning was that I really wanted him to be able to have some distance from the life that he had lived, because I think it's so interesting when you understand your life in hindsight, and the kinds of things that you take away from the experiences that you've lived after they have happened is so fascinating to me, because when you think about things that happened to you, maybe awful or painful or traumatic things that happened 20, 15 years ago, you have some clarity on them almost, you almost see why things happen the way they did, like as if your life were a jigsaw puzzle, where all these little pieces kind of fall into place. And it's only when you're at the end of your life when you really see the bigger picture, and so for Bastian being dead, it was the perfect vantage point, because finally he gets to see the whole picture that he could not necessarily have seen, when he was alive. But of course, Bastian being dead, I mean, having him be alive in terms of telling the story was always going to be a complication. How do you make a dead character be alive, and I thought the only way to do that really, apart from leaning on a bit of magical realism, was to kind of have him be sort of between two worlds in a way, where he is very much Bastian, the dead guy talking from the grave, but at the same time he's still taking the reader on this journey, the journey of his life, the journey of his death, and the journey of whatever happens after.
And it comes through very convincingly, because, like you say, he's got this bird's eye view on his life at this point, and he's able to reflect on what's happening to him as he's being ready for the grave, and once he was inside it.
Right.
But so beautifully told in terms of, because it's almost like you're dealing with different characters when you see him at different ages, being able to reflect.
So
And I have to say, he doesn't seem to have much regret. I said, there's, when you have a way of looking at life in retrospect, there's sometimes regret, but he doesn't seem to have regret, because he has this expanse of reflection that happens through the novel. So it's very beautiful, very convincingly
Yeah, thank
told.
you.
The case of the Racial Classifications Board.
Mm,
We talk about the absurdity of classification on the
right.
basis of eye color and skin color and hair type,
Yeah.
phenotype. And that comes through when, he suddenly decides, well, he was brought up in this white family and now he wants to be reclassified as he firmly believes that
Mm,
he's not.
yes.
And he's actually bringing the legal system to actually ask itself, like, you're reading this and you're thinking, but you're insisting this man's a white man.
Right.
And he's saying he's not. And he's denying that privilege. And he
Right.
insists
Right.
on branding him with that privilege or he will be punished.
Right.
Talk to us about some of the research that went into bringing this into play,
Right.
or,
Right.
how.
Yeah. So the first thing about the Race Classification Appeals Board, and I think it's something that we as South Africans sometimes forget, is just how absolutely bizarre our history is.
Right.
It's almost like, I think, when we say the word apartheid, we've almost become desensitized to it, I think, sometimes. We actually forget just what that meant, for the majority of South Africans, and just how absolutely absurd, which is the word you used, which is the perfect word, it was absurd. And so, I've always loved history, and particularly South African history. And the first time I read about the Race Classification Appeals Board, I was so blown away by it. I thought, can you believe that there was once a place where you could go and argue for or against the color of your own skin? And I thought, what must that have felt like, to actually go there and convince someone else that you're not as brown as you are or as black as you are, or, with this hope that you want to come out a shade lighter than what you went in. What a bizarre thought process, and what an unbelievably traumatic emotional experience, I think, just to even have to make that argument or make that case against yourself. I mean, because that really is what it is. You're arguing against yourself. And so that was the first thing that I thought, and I love what if questions, by the way. So the first thing I thought was, so here's this place where everyone wants to go and come out a shade lighter. What if somebody went there and wanted to come out a shade darker? What would that mean for that individual? And what would it mean for that society at that time? And of course, it would have been this huge media frenzy, which is what I try and capture in the book as well. But in terms of the research of the book, so I have to say that some of it was incredibly emotional for me personally, as a Black South African, as a woman of color. It was very difficult to go to the South African National Archives sometimes and to read some of the old newspapers, which is what I did, to try and capture some of the nuance and essence and to put into the book. And that was sometimes a very emotionally draining thing to do, and sometimes I found I actually had to take a bit of a time out from the work, just to kind of take a step back to sort of feel like, okay, I need to just take a breather before going back to it again. But in terms of the research, I mean, all of that really came from reading old newspapers. And there is an extract, which I'm sure you've seen at the back of the book as well, which is basically an excerpt from an actual interview that happened at the Race Classification Appeals Board. And I mean, just reading those questions, I hope, everybody will actually really understand that was the kind of questioning, the kind of experiences, that the majority of South Africans at some point or the other, were subjected to if they chose to go, that route. And it is unbelievably traumatic. I mean, even just to imagine or to fictionalize, let alone what it must have been like in a real world scenario.
And what you've accomplished here is, an important social document, even if you've used the vehicle of fiction. Because sometimes I wonder, it's one thing to read these kinds of cases in fiction, almost more palatable, you could say, and to realize that people went through this. So especially important for many who have not lived through apartheid, or many who were not aware that there was this, the Racial Classifications Appeal Board, for example.
Yes.
In terms of response, you bring up issues of identity, race, almost the kind of weapon of using certain words to make someone feel lesser. Condescending
Yeah,
words like the K word comes up in your book.
right.
And what does that mean for readers, and what kind of response have you had so far from readers, perhaps younger
Mm.
readers, older readers who are triggered
Yeah,
by the sort of language?
yeah, that's a great question. You know, I debated that a lot at one point, about whether I should include it or not. It is such a loaded word. I mean, as we all know, especially as South African, especially as South Africans. But that being said, the one thing was that I really wanted to stay true to what the time period was about. And in order to do that, I thought I shouldn't shy away from the ugliness, because that is, of course, what racism is. It's the real, it's the ugliness of who we are, so that was the one thing. The second thing was that was really important to me was just how much the past and the present for me, are the same. They are so unbelievably interrelated. I think that sometimes it's almost difficult to realize that the present is not the past. If I can use just an example, I'm a journalist by profession, as you mentioned at the beginning. And just a few years ago, we had a case with the Vicky Momberg or Penny Sparrow who also used the K word, where she in fact hurled the K word more than 30 times, at somebody in public, and it was caught on film, etc., etc. So I don't think we should lull ourselves into the sense of complacency that, oh, the K word was something that was just used, in our past. It is by all, based on everything we've seen, it is very much something that people still think is okay, and of course there is absolutely no reason ever, when that is okay. And so certainly in this book, it was used as a literary device to really, really show people that this is more than a word. As you said, it's a weapon. It is something that dehumanizes people. So that's the first thing. The second answer, in relation to your question about the response. So this for me has been particularly interesting, because I think younger people, particularly born frees, for those who don't know, born frees are those born after democracy. Their response to this has been so fascinating to me, in the kinds of conversations that I've had with them, because I find that younger people who have not lived in apartheid or did not grow up during apartheid have this almost unquenchable thirst to know, more about our past. And then you have this older generation, my parents' generation and their parents' generation, who almost want to have this distance, where they don't want to talk about it, and so there's almost this disconnect sometimes between, the younger South Africans and the older generations. And I think young people, more than anyone, perhaps should read this book, I think, to kind of really understand where we've come from and to gain some kind of perspective about who we really are as a nation.
I'm glad you mentioned, for example, that it's important for us not to become complacent around the issues that arise from the past and how we're seeing it playing out in our current dimension, so to speak. And the interplay between how what's expected of his sort of history from the older generation and how the younger generation is receiving this kind of material. It's so easy for the trauma of the poor and the trauma of people who of color who have been discriminated against to be weaponized, to be used by different forms of leadership. Especially if authority is sort of a voice of authority is used to mobilize for whatever reason, and we're seeing that happening around us right now. So it's important for us to remember that in some ways we're recovering racist as a country, and that complacency is actually more dangerous and more works more against us. I don't know if I can get you to read a small extract from the book. Favorite piece, a beginning piece, or
Yeah.
even the from the racial appeal board, because I
All
think
right.
that's. Well, I'm not sort of gonna coerce you to read exactly that, but perhaps a
um,
small extract you could introduce us to,
right,
even more
right.
later on in the show.
Yes, gladly. So I will do that. Do you want to ask some questions first, and I can fetch the book because I realize it's on my bookshelf.
That's perfectly fine. So if you don't want to actually read an extract, we can continue the chat for now. Um, Suitcase of Memory.
Yeah,
You talk about also about your protagonist having this ability to remember from the past. So is this
yeah,
a tool you used for the telling of the tale, or is this really, um, something that people experience, where they're able to
yeah.
remember as far back as being a baby or being
Right,
born in this particular
right,
instance?
right,
I
right.
really
So
wondered about that.
right. So, as I said, so Bastian Bierenkamp has this, he has this condition, hypothymesia. So, firstly, it's a fictional novel, but this illness that he suffers from, is a legitimate illness. Of course, I took some liberties with it, in terms of the fictional aspect of the book. So while hypothymesia is something where you remember in minute detail, all the things that happened to you in your life, you may not necessarily be able to remember as far back as, when you were born, but certainly, soon after, and all the things that happened to you. So there's a scene in the book where Bastian talks to his nanny, Khadija, and he recounts their meeting. And he talks to her, and he's able to tell her what she was wearing on that day and what he was wearing on that day. He recalls what was playing on the news that day, what was the lead story on the news bulletin, what the weather was like that day, how many carrots were in her shopping bag that day. And so hypothymesia is a really fascinating condition. It's incredibly rare as well. From when I first read about it, this medical condition, there were about 80 people in the world who suffer from this condition, and it's incurable. It's kind of this curious case of remembering, really, that no one fully understands. And when I first read about it, I came across an article where a woman was talking about what it was like to be able to remember, in such minute detail. And she was talking about how it was almost like watching a movie in your mind, all the memories that you've had before, while at the same time living your life in real time. And that I thought was a really interesting premise for a book, which is, of course, the book that exists today.
I think such a beautiful tool for the way that you told the story as well. But amazing because for me it also speaks to a mind fully engaged in life if we're able to remember so much, in our short lifespan. So I think
Right.
fascinating
I mean,
use of
and
tools.
just in terms of memory, I really thought, so what would it be like to remember everything that happened to you, truly? And remember, when you remember things, it's not just about the good things, it's the bad things too. Do you really want to be able to remember a terrible argument you may have had with your spouse or your mother or whoever, in that much minute detail, where you're able to recall that conversation verbatim? Do you want to carry that with you forever? So it's this double-edged sword. Of course, the beautiful moments you wish you could relive over and over and over again, but it comes with both. You can't have the one and not the other, which is,
Right.
of course, the title as well, in terms of Suitcase of Memory. It's this idea of the things we carry with us, and we all have those things, the good things, the bad things, the things we wish we could forget, but those are the things that we all have in our own suitcase.
And how much can you fit into that suitcase?
And how
Um,
much can you fit into that suitcase? Precisely.
And in narrative retellings, whether it's from a sort of autobiographical method or through fiction, we often talk of the reliance on memory. So you've used that to its fullest extent in this kind of fictionalized memoir of your protagonist. And so, once again, just really, really great use of it. What can we look forward to in the future from your pen, because I'm hoping bookshelves are going to be filled with many, many books.
Yeah, I'm hoping that too, but who knows? At the moment, I'm busy writing my second novel. I'm about halfway through it at the moment. I'm hoping it's not going to take me another 15 years, maybe. But for me, themes are the things that drive my fiction. So much like with Suitcase of Memory, the themes were around memory, obviously, around history, around identity. Those are core themes in Suitcase of Memory. And so with the book that I'm writing at the moment, it's also a novel and fiction. I'd like to think that it builds on some of the themes that Suitcase of Memory, puts out into the public space. And so this book really explores themes around justice. It explores the themes around injustice, as well as human dignity and restoration, which I think is a conversation that we as a nation haven't really spoken about enough. What does restoration mean, really? If someone's human dignity is taken away, can it ever be given back? So those are the kinds of themes, that I hope to build on, as we move forward.
When you look at Bredenkamp, he's also got the seamless move from when he learns about Christianity and he has a love also through Khadija 3, learning about Islam. And
Yes.
and for him, there isn't this great dichotomy between the two. So, this idea that on the one hand, he relies on his expansive memory to know himself, to process his life, process his traumas and his joys. And then you see his sort of deep spirituality, even though not sort of in your face, it's just there. It's part of life. You often hear them saying to know yourself is to know God. And so you beautifully show that aspect of him as well. The religious, the spiritual, the secular, and the respect that comes out of that as well. So I look forward to your next novel already, no pressure. Thank you so much for treating us to such a beautiful novel, Aisha, and especially also for the time that you've given us this evening. It always feels short when it's a nice a beautiful discussion about
it's
it.
really short for me as well. But it was lovely to talk to you, and thank you for such great questions and for taking away, the kinds of things that I really hope people take away from it. It's really heartwarming as the writer when people really, really identify with the work and take away the kinds of things that you hope people will see. So.
And I think your book will have traction with people of all ages. And I certainly hope that people will be picking up this copy because on the one hand, it like I said before, it's a social document of what's happened, what's past and what's present, but it allows us to reflect on how to make something of the future. And now more than ever, we need that kind of leadership. If it comes through books and such beautifully written books, then I think we're on the right track. So once again, thank you so much for your time. And I know that we will have you in the future when there's more writing from you. Inshallah. Keep warm and keep well.
Inshallah. Shukran so much for having me again, Shafinaaz. Be well.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And there you have it, Aisha Kassiem, of the author of Suitcase of Memory, a beautiful collection of writings, and definitely something to pick up on, to gift, a must-have on every bookshelf. Don't forget to join us on the 1st of August at the Josie Books and Blogs Festival. A great lineup of writing will be available from 9 in the morning until 4 in the evening. It's an online festival. Just go to their page. And all the sessions are free to join. We'll be talking about teen and tween writing at 11 a.m. rather. We can also look forward to the launch or unveiling of the South African, the anthology of the Essence of South Africanness anthology. And later in the evening, it closes with the major launch of the book edited by Sue Nyathi, When Secrets Speak. Please join us next week, Sunday, for a whole day of literary sessions. And with that, I close off on this evening's session. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.